They enter the quiet spaces beneath the earth where air cools and settles and every sound is absorbed by stone. The first traces in darkness appear as thin films of pigment on limestone, and as soft incisions where fingers drag across damp surfaces, and the record begins not with a shout but with a layer so slight it might vanish if touched. The scene repeats across continents during the late Pleistocene. People walk or crawl into chambers, carry embers cupped in stone lamps, and face walls that undulate like the flanks of animals. In this present moment of the story, tens of millennia ago, a person places a palm against the rock and blows ochre from a hollow bird bone or reed. A negative hand blooms crisp at the edges, where skin seals to stone and feathered at the heel where air leaks. This small gesture, reproduced thousands of times from Iberia to Sulawesi, declares presence without a name and becomes one of the earliest stable signs of human attention. Some images gain dates that anchor the narrative. Uranium-thorium measurements taken on calcite crusts show red discs and stencils in Spanish caves are older than 64,000 years, implying that Neanderthals may have made them, while a figurative painting of a pig in Leang Tedongenge, Sulawesi, is at least 45 or 500 years old, marking one of the oldest known depictions of an animal. In the narrow beam of a torch, soot maps old paths on ceilings. Black arcs where firebrands brushed rock mark pauses or points of return, memorials of movement more durable than footsteps. This is a world colder than today, a climate that breathes in glacial rhythm and locks ocean water in ice. Sea levels sit far lower, and coastlines extend outward in wide plains where rivers snake longer to meet a distant surf. As glaciers thicken, winds sharpen, and the steppe tundra spreads, pushing herds and the people who follow them across enormous ranges. Caves that open near once coastal cliffs will in warmer times stand far inland, and the planetary scale of this change frames the tiniest mark in mineral dust. The wall suggests animals even before pigment scalloped protrusions, bulges and fissures present forms to an eye trained by repetition, and the painter learns to coax image from relief by placing lines where shadows already hint at a contour. The animal steps forward because a mind predicts it there. At some sites, dots march in deliberate clusters and ladders, signs layered under or over animals as if belonging to a separate system. At others, broad fields of ochre glow like embers set into stone. The ingredients lie in reach, but not always at hand. Ochre must be gathered ground and mixed with water, saliva, or fat charcoal made in slow burns where wood smoulders in low oxygen and manganese dioxide collected from veins that sometimes lie far from the cave. A quieter detail survives in the residue of light. Small stone cups blackened on the rim, probably filled with animal fat and fitted with plant fibre wicks sit where tunnels bend, allowing hands to work in steady illumination rather than in fire's flicker. The choice of location is consistent and strange in equal measure. Many images cluster deep inside beyond daylit zones, where people might have slept or butchered. The descent requires knowledge of passages, a sense of direction, and the courage to re-enter darkness repeatedly. Acoustic tests in several decorated chambers show strong echoes and resonances, and though the paintings remain silent, the spaces answer voice and percussion, suggesting that sound, image, and fire cohere in a choreography whose purpose is not recorded in words. The mind that paints also remembers, and a cave visited across generations becomes a layered document. Mineral skins condense, drip, and seal over marks, and later hands return to the same panels, adding figures, retracing outlines, finding the ridge that still carries the shoulder of a bison. The act is not improvisational. It depends on skill that must be shown, imitated, and corrected. Small details imply teaching fingerprints, and fine parallel finger flutings at reachable heights include widths consistent with children as well as adults. Stencils vary in size, some belonging to very small hands, and overlaps demonstrate that makers observed and worked around earlier images rather than simply covering them. Disciplinary knowledge extends to safety and logistics. Lines of soot dots can mark routes, and deposits of spent torches accumulate in alcoves that function like staging areas. A single chamber might hold many layers of time at a red disk, under a calcite veil that grew drop by drop for tens of thousands of years. A black horse darted in charcoal over that mineral skin. A later finger-drawn motif rippled where condensation softened the surface. The science that reveals this order reads growth like tree rings, but its account stops at purpose. Why these places? Why these animals? Why this stubborn refusal to draw human bodies in detail when wild creatures fill the wall? Some scholars propose that these scenes encode knowledge of prey or seasonal movement. Others suggest ritual initiation healing, or an effort to represent visions that arise from altered states, perhaps prompted by darkness, drum, and flame. The evidence, though abundant, remains mute on intention, and the mystery holds the marks confirm attention and planning, yet withhold their specific meanings. As the people of this world cross basins and peninsulas now submerged, they carry pigments, techniques, and habits of perception. Their roots stretch across distances wider than many modern nations, sometimes farther than the line from Paris to Seoul. Still, the same decisions recur with local inflections, as if a shared framework travels by memory and practice rather than by script. The animals vary by region: bison and horses in the West, pigs, and anoa in Ireland, Southeast Asia, macropods on the rock faces of Australia. But the grammar of curve, contour, and internal line continues to solve the same problem: how to make a body move on a still surface. The first traces in stone darkness show a mind that composes scenes from partial cues, binds sequences across time, and persists in revisiting a place to add refine and answer what is already there. Fire supports this work not only as light but as chemistry. Heating ochre can shift its hue and improve adhesion, and soot provides a carbon that endures where moisture might degrade other media. Water too plays a part. Capillary films brighten or dull, pigment depending on season, and dripstone grows like a slow curtain that both protects and obscures what lies beneath. The cave itself becomes collaboration between geology and culture, and the resulting palimpsest lets researchers test dates, reconstruct techniques, and trace movement with unprecedented resolution. Yet the simplest image remains the most revealing: a hand-shaped palm and fingers splayed print of a breath guided by a tube framed by the stone's own boundary. It is an index of presence and a lesson in absence, the person gone, and the mark persisting, the exact gesture preserved, but the context dissolved. In that balance, the mind declares both its reach and its limits. It claims a surface, learns a material, and inscribes a memory, but it cannot compel the future to know why. The first traces tell us that symbolic behaviour is not an ornament added late, but a core practice embedded in movement, subsistence, and attention. They tell us that the capacity to see pictures in surfaces is ancient and robust, and they place the human story inside the larger breath of the planet, whose ice and sea set the stage and whose stone quietly keeps the evidence. They stand before red-on stone and ask who made it. The question circles the Spanish caves where calcite skins of sealed pigment like pages pressed beneath glass, and the science reads ages from trace elements locked into that mineral veil. In Maltravieso, a hand stencil lies under a film that tests older than 64,000 years. In La Pasiega, a ladder-shaped motif, the rungs and uprights drawn in red, rests beneath similar deposits. In Ardelès, the stalagmitic dome carries washes of hematite that long predate the arrival of Homo sapiens in Iberia, if the uranium-thorium clocks hold steady. The method gives a minimum age by dating calcite that formed after the painting uranium dissolves into cave water and decays to thorium once locked in the deposit, and the ratio between them acts like a slow metronome. If the measured layers are indeed younger than the paint they cover, then the images belong to a time when the peninsula is Neanderthal country, and the silhouettes, dots and lines become a record of their hands at work. This is the fact that anchors the section there exist motifs in Iberian caves whose calcite overgrowths yield ages earlier than any widely accepted sapiens presence west of the Pyrenees, implying Neanderthal authorship. Yet the history of stone is complicated. Carbonate flows creep and pool, and detrital grains lodge within them. Small amounts of old thorium can make young deposits look older, and critics argue that sampling must be exquisitely targeted to avoid contamination or mixed generations of calcite. The debate stays professional but unresolved. Some teams reaffirm early ages with replicate samples and microstratigraphy. Others caution that uncertainties remain and that claims of authorship must withstand every alternative explanation. The paintings do not speak for themselves. Their testimony is a sequence of measurements and comparisons, and the conclusion remains a working hypothesis supported by some lines of evidence and resisted by others. Beyond the walls, other clues to Neanderthal symbolism accumulate. In a cave near Murcia, shells bear pigment residues and deliberate perforations with dates around 100,000 years and older. At Krapina in Croatia, eagle talons show cut marks and polish as if strung or handled repeatedly. At Bruniquel in southern France, broken stalagmites arranged into circular structures sit more than 300 metres from the entrance and date to roughly 176,000 years, with reddened areas and burnt bone implying controlled fire in the deep zone. None of these finds alone proves painting, but together they map a behaviour set that includes colour selection, object modification for display and purposeful activity in darkness. The lesser-known detail hides into chemistry. Certain Neanderthal sites yield manganese dioxide blocks not simply as pigment, but as a possible fire aid, because this mineral can lower the ignition temperature of wood. Ground to powder and sprinkled onto kindling, it plausibly helps coals catch more readily in cold, damp air. If Neanderthals experiment with mineral properties for both practical and symbolic aims, the Red Ladder in La Pasiega fits a world where material knowledge and meaning move together. The planetary backdrop frames these acts in cycles longer than any tradition. Around 64,000 years ago, the climate oscillates within marine isotope stage 4 and 3 instabilities. Ice sheets wax and wane, sea levels fall and rise by tens of metres, and the Atlantic coastline shifts over continental shelves now drowned. Iberia, buffered by oceanic influence and cut by mountain ranges, becomes a patchwork of refuges where woodland and steppe alternate across relatively short distances. Rivers carve corridors through limestone and leave voids that later become decorated chambers. Dripwater chemistry changes with rainfall patterns, controlling the growth of calcite skins and milieu that both protect and confuse the record. On this stage, people adapt locally, yet share techniques that travel with them, as surely as stone cores and prepared flakes. They do not march with banners or plot routes on maps. They track valleys, water, and game through terrain that transforms over a lifetime. The distance from Ardales in Malaga to Maltravieso in Cáceres measures longer than the line from London to Paris, and yet the repeated choice of hand stencil and red wash suggests either parallel invention within one species or a borrowing across contact zones where populations meet. Genetic evidence tells its own quiet story later. Modern humans in Eurasia carry segments of Neanderthal DNA that point to interbreeding between roughly 60 and 45,000 years ago, a signal of proximity and time together that aligns with archaeology's patchy chorus. If Neanderthals paint what do they intend, the walls do not answer. The motifs in the Spanish caves are simple compared to the animal-rich panels of Lascaux or Chauvet, but simplicity need not mean poverty of meaning. A ladder, a dot field, a stenciled hand can mark routes, count events, claim presence, signal membership, or designate a place for sound. They might also belong to a system of signs whose key is lost. Some researchers propose that the placement of red on stalagmitic formations at Ardales marks dripping surfaces that gleam in torchlight, turning the calcite into a living thing that bleeds colour. Others see touch points for rituals, places to return in cycles known to the group. It remains a mystery whether the authors paint for teaching, for initiation, for an account of days, for communion with animals or landforms, or for something the modern lexicon fails to name. The caution is as important as the wonder evidence of symbolic behaviour does not require that Neanderthals imagine in the same ways as later sapiens. It tells us only that they manage materials and spaces to produce effects that extend beyond immediate survival. The tools of that management are humble and repeatable. Red ochre, hematite, or goethite must be selected for hue and hardness, tested against rock, and mixed to a consistency that adheres yet flows through a tube when blown. Hands need to be pressed firmly to prevent bleed at the edges, breath must be steady, light must be set where it neither scorches nor sputters, The finished stencil captures anatomy with more fidelity than a brushstroke might, recording finger length and hand proportions. Measurements on samples from various continents show population-level variation, and studies of finger flutings, parallel grooves drawn with fingertips, indicate contributors spanning ages and likely sexes. If such diversity also holds in Iberian sites, then the red signs may encode social participation as much as individual authorship and early pedagogy woven into stone. Over this canvas of stone and time, the pace remains slow. Calcite drip, one ring at a time. Pigment darkens or brightens with moisture, and galleries breathe as outside air warms or cools. Torch smoke blackens ceilings in stippled clouds. Soot flecks stuck in films of condensation become timestamps for a visit. The planets tilt the dance of ice. The chemistry of groundwater and the behaviour of small fires determine what endures and what fades. In that layered setting, the hypothesis of Neanderthal painting stands not as a declaration, but as a careful reading of intersecting processes, each with uncertainties that responsible scholars enumerate. Whether or not every early date survives future sampling, the broader picture holds minds older than our species. European expansion manipulate colour, light, echo, and form in chosen underground places. The lesson carried forward is neither triumph nor failure, but continuity, a cognitive landscape where symbol and skill grow in step with stone. If one follows the chain from mineral vein to mixing, from breath to stencil, from drip to calcite skin, the red hand becomes both record and mirror, a sign that the capacity to make marks that outlast their makers is shared across close cousins, and that the border once drawn between their minds and our minds narrows like a corridor in the dark until only the sound of a footfall and the flare of a wick remains to tell them apart. They travel across continents yet leave the same quiet sign, a breath-driven veil of pigment that halos a hand and fixes a moment of touch to stone. In Cantabria and Dordogne, in the Argentinian canyon of Cava de las Manos, in the limestone casts of Sulawesi and Borneo, in the sandstone shelters of Arnhem Land, the silhouette repeats with local colour and technique but stable intent. The fact is, straightforward negative hand stencils occur widely from at least 40,000 years ago in island Southeast Asia and Europe, with some panels in Sulawesi dated by uranium-thorium methods to more than 40,000 years, and hand clusters in Cueva de las Manos framed between 13 and 9,000 years before present. Across these sites, most stencils are left hands, implying the blower holds the tube in a dominant right hand, a pattern that confirms right-handedness as a deep human trait. The method requires little beyond preparation: ochre ground to powder, sometimes roasted to shift hue, a binder of water, saliva, or fat, a hollow bone or reed, steady breath, and a light that burns clean so soot does not cloud the edge. Some painters spit pigment directly, others press close and use a tube, producing crisper margins where the skin seals to rock. Children participate. Very small spans appear among adult hands and finger flutings, parallel grooves drawn on soft film show widths, consistent with juvenile fingertips alongside larger tracks. Among lesser noted details, archaeologists have recovered blowpipes stained inside with ochre from cave floors. And in Australian shelters, the stenciled silhouettes of boomerangs, digging sticks, and spear throwers sit beside hand recording tools as well as people. The surfaces chosen are seldom flat. Painters favour concavities, ridges, and where the wall already seems to invite a boundary. In some Spanish chambers, the densest clusters occur where sound carries best pairing echo and image without requiring any single explanation. The planetary frame sets conditions for both making and endurance. During the late Pleistocene, sea levels fall by more than 100 metres as ice thickens. Coastlines extend. The Sunda Shelf links mainland Asia to Borneo and Java, and routes into Sulawesi and onward to Sahul depend on island chains and water gaps narrower than today. Humidity drip rates and the chemistry of seepage change with climate, laying calcite skins that later let scientists date the minimum age of a stencil, or eroding pigment so that only a ghost remains. Under these rhythms, a hand is fragile yet stubborn, fading here and brightening there. The mystery that endures is meaning. Why hands and why so many possible answers remain plural, a marker of presence, a teaching device, a sign used in counting, telling, or naming, a ritual act linked to sound and fire, a code in bent digits. Across Europe, some stencils show missing or folded fingers. Hypotheses range from cold-induced tucking to injury to amputation to deliberate signing. Experiments with hand postures reproduce many patterns without amputation, yet in some ethnographic contexts finger removal exists, so the wall refuses certainty. A different enigma concerns authorship demographics. Analyses that compare index to ring finger ratios once suggested a high proportion of female contributors at some European sites. Later critiques argue that variation and measurement error complicate such assignments. The cautious reading is simply that multiple people contribute adults and the children, likely of different sexes, turning a panel into a communal record rather than a single hand signature. Colour choices vary but fall into families reds and purples from hematite and other iron oxides, blacks from charcoal or manganese minerals, occasional yellows that fade faster. In Patagonia, long airy lines of hands create gradients from dense bands to solitary prints. In Europe, stencils surround deeper chambers where animals dominate. In each region, geology dictates palette and preservation iron-rich rock. Gifts, reds that endure. Porous sandstone drinks pigment quickly and softens edges. Hard limestone keeps a sharp halo when the binder is lean. Scale clarifies the shared habit's reach. Across more than 10,000 kilometres, the Cantabrian caves and the karsts of Sulawesi both host dense fields of hands made by breath and mineral dust in chambers shaped for echo. This breadth does not require a single origin. Parallel invention suffices because the human body supplies the stencil and rock offers the canvas, wherever people and pigment meet. At several sites, hands tilt or stack to follow a natural curve as though the rock itself asks for a sweep. At others, they step up a narrowing passage like guide marks for return. Pigment grains embedded in calcite sometimes carry microstratigraphic clues, coarse angular fragments from freshly ground ore's textures that distinguish episodes of work that otherwise overlap invisibly. Where calcite later veils the images, it also preserves them, creating a translucent skin that can be dated, while the paint remains beyond the reach of radiocarbon. Radiocarbon still contributes when soot from adjacent torches survives, though firebrands are easily moved and cannot tie a date directly to a specific stencil. Their glow nonetheless tells of the lighting plan, small steady flames set on shelves or in stone cups to free both hands with brighter torches used for movement along the route. Across continents, the choreography repeats approach, press, breathe, step away, and repetition is part of the message, a habit sturdy enough to outlast ice cycles and shoreline maps. As glacial phases advance and withdraw, deserts expand, then retreat rivers cut, and then widen, and caves near ancient valleys become high lookouts above modern floors. The hands keep their scale across all of it. Palm fingers, a wrist fading into open stone. They reveal a mind comfortable with negative image, with the idea that an absence can assert presence. They formalize touch into sign. They allow groups to see themselves layered in a place over time. What begins as a breath becomes a ledger of visits, yet the ledger does not gloss itself. Do clusters record seasons, births, initiations, agreements? Do bent digits encode local counting or shared signals along travel corridors? Do tools stenciled beside Hande Indians denote teaching moments or identity marks for those who carry them? The safest conclusion is modest hand fields demonstrate planning cooperation and an attention to material and acoustic properties. They bind people to a chamber and to one another. They persist because stone and climate collaborate to keep them. In that partnership between breath and rock, one fleeting, one slow, the oldest hands across the world tell as much about social memory as they do about individuals, and they show that while landscapes alter under ice and sea, a small repeated act endures long enough to anchor thought to place. They face walls where animals step forward as if the stone remembers their breath, and the line between rock and life softens under charcoal ochre and touch. In these chambers, the mind learns to make bodies move on still surfaces, to coax a flank from a swelling in limestone and a gallop from a sequence of legs. Horses crowd the panels of Chauvet where dates cluster in the mid-upper Paleolithic. Lions glide along a ledge without manes accurately rendering the dimorphism of the extinct cave lion. Rhinoceroses push horn against horn in overlapping silhouettes that read as motion when seen by torchlight. At Lascaux, the black bulls tilt with a force that pulls the viewer along the gallery, their heads enlarged and horns drawn in twisted perspective so that both are visible. Beneath them, smaller figures cross like notes in a score. The painters work with a restrained kit charcoal from controlled fires, manganese oxides for deep black, iron oxides for reds and browns, mineral whites from scraped limestone and with techniques that prize contour first shading. Second outlines are traced with confident continuous strokes, interiors smudged with stumping or brushed with pads of fur or plant fibre, highlights made by scraping away the outer film to reveal the pale stone beneath. The fact that grounds this section is plain. Upper Paleolithic panels in Europe and elsewhere present animals with high anatomical fidelity and deliberate illusion, including devices to suggest motion modelling and depth, long before any formal system of perspective. Some figures carry multiple sets of legs or horns and overlap that reads like animation when the eye and flame move. Others align with ridges so that a shoulder swells and a hip recedes in the rock itself. In the Salon Noir of Neo, bison stand poised with lowered heads as if listening their humps perfectly pitched to the curve of the ceiling. In Altamira, polychrome bison float on a roving vault, where the stone's bulges serve as ribs and bellies, the red and black blending into a life that seems to breathe as lamps pass. A lesser-known detail ties image to genetics. The spotted horses of Peshmerl, long debated as fanciful, find support in ancient DNA that shows the leopard complex coat pattern existed in European Pleistocene horse populations, suggesting that the painters copy what they see rather than imagine it. Another quiet detail rests in method experiments and microscopic observations indicate that some artists pre-incise guides before painting, lightly scoring a path for the later line. Elsewhere, dotted outlines mark an early stage that the painter then unifies into a continuous contour. In several sites, the presence of engraved lines under paint hints at planning, akin to an underdrawing adjusted by smudging and scraping until the figure settles into the wall. The mystery remains why certain species dominate while staples of diet appear rarely. Reindeer abundant in archaeological middens during some periods are outnumbered on many walls by horses, bison, aurochs and felids. Carnivores dangerous and seldom hunted receive prominent treatment in places like Chauvet and Trois Frères. Scholars propose hunting magic clan emblems, totemic hierarchies, narrative myths, or an aesthetic drawn to massive shoulders, sweeping horns and the drama of herd animals in motion. The evidence allows for all and commits to none. Another enigma is narrative sequence. Superimpositions can look like stories predator and prey pursuit and escape, but methods for dating layers rarely resolve the order of individual strokes, and the cave refuses to say whether the eye's story belongs to the maker's intent or to the mind's appetite for plots. The planetary stage sets both subject and technique. During glacial maxima, the steppe tundra spirals out from Iberia through the plains of Central Europe into Siberia, linking distant biomes in a corridor of grass and cold. Herds travel across ranges that could stretch the length of 1,000 kilometers longer than the line from Prague to Paris, and people follow with their own seasonal arcs mapping migration and terrain in memory. Lowered seas expose shelves, widen river mouths and change winds. Dust loads rise and fall, influencing the clarity of skies and the quality of light that filters into cave mouths. Within the stable microclimates of deep chambers, humidity buffers pigment from the extremes outside, while calcite forms veils that alternately preserve and obscure, a geological shutter opening and closing over millennia. The animals chosen and the ways they are drawn across this span show consistent attention to particular body parts, neck, shoulder, hindquarter, and to the rhythms of gait. The painters appear to watch closely to carry in the mind an index of poses that a few strokes can unlock. Precision extends to details: the dorsal stripe on some horses, the beard on ibex, the forked beard of chamois, the heavy dewlap of aurochs, the angular hock of bison. Such cues tell species at a glance. In a handful of panels, internal lines mark muscles or the edge of a rib cage. At Lascaux, a bison's black molting pattern follows the seasonal shedding known to herders tens of millennia later. On other walls, breadth and angle turn pigment into texture. Charcoal yields a matte black that absorbs light. Manganese gives a denser metallic black that reflects the lamp's point more sharply. Red ochres vary from rusty to purple depending on heat, and mineral companions and binders of water or fat determine whether the stroke flakes or sinks. The social choreography behind the image stays legible at the edges: footprints of adults and children pressed into soft clay near decorated panels, torch smears where a branch was struck against a wall, cupules left by tapping, lampstones dropped and abandon their soot-curled wicks fused to the rim. These traces imply repeated visits, instruction and roles: someone mixing pigment at a cache, someone lighting and tending lamps, someone tracing lines, others watching, perhaps naming parts or correcting a curve by touch. They also point to a sense of a proper place for each animal zones, where horses gather others, where bison rule clusters of felids separated from prey. Whether these arrangements hold a grammar of oppositions, as some analysts have argued, or simply reflect local custom remains unsettled. The regularities are real, the key unknown. In island Southeast Asia, the motif of Suid's wild pigs dominates one painted in Sulawesi, with a fringe of facial warts and a forehead crest rendered with care. Elsewhere, small bovids appear short-legged and compact, the artists meeting different bodies with the same grammar of outline and relief. Across continents, a common logic emerges: choose a panel whose geology carries the target form. Prepare a path around the figure. Place the line decisively. Shade where the rock caves inward and scrape where it bulges outward. Set the animal at the scale the wall suggests rather than the scale of the hand. Under torchlight, the curvature of rock becomes animation. A shift in stance sets the bison walking. A flicker makes the rhino clash. That collaboration between geology, flame, and drawing is not an accident but a practiced outcome, learned, transmitted, and remembered. As ice draws oceans down and pushes wind across open plains, as coastlines unspool and then retreat, these rooms keep their temperate damp and their emptiness of weather, and for that reason the animals outlast the herds they portray. The lesson the walls give is less about the hunt than about attention. To watch is to know, and to know is to select, exaggerate, and place. Animals step forward because someone studied the hinge of a joint and the bellies sag, the rhythm at which a head bobs when a trot becomes a canter. They step forward because a community returns to the same dark and finds in stone and light the means to make time hold still long enough for motion to be seen. They learn to make stillness move to set a body on rock so that torchlight completes the gesture, and in these experiments the cave becomes a laboratory for vision, where geology, flame, and memory collaborate. The wall is not just backdrop, it is instrument and lens. Painters choose convexities for shoulders, concavities for bellies, ledges for spines, and use the stone's curve as a ready-made contour. The first stroke discovers a flank already present in limestone. At Lascaux, bulls show twisted perspective, both horns visible with the head still in profile, a deliberate distortion that reads as plausible under a lamp's roving beam. At Chauvet, rhinoceroses and lions accumulate overlapping outlines, extra legs and doubled horns that the eye reads as motion when fire flickers. The fact holds that many Paleolithic figures carry supernumerary limbs or repeated contours and are placed on sculpted rock so that relief and shadow simulate volume and movement. This is not naivete, but a solution to the problem of animating stillness without a fixed vantage point or daylight. The makers understand light even if they do not name optics. A torch sputters, brightens, and dims. A fat lamp steadies its wick set low and trimmed. Archaeologists recover lampstones from upper Paleolithic layers, shallow basins with soot-blackened rims and residues of animal fat from sites including Lascaux and La Maude. Their shapes fit the hand, and their quiet flames allow a person to work both line and shading without choking the chamber in smoke. A lesser-known detail sits in the soot itself. Some residues creep in thin tongues up one side of a lamp's rim, implying a habitual tilt that points the flame forward like a small mobile spotlight. Burn marks on ledges beneath panels repeat at intervals as though lamps were parked in the same niches. Each visit an arrangement that would stabilize shadows and fix the script by which figures appear to move. The path through a gallery supports this choreography. Footprints in soft clay, some small enough to be children's arc along panel edges. Torch smears strike at turning points. Percussion marks sound out spaces with strong echoes. A viewer walks, stops, raises light, and the animal steps forward. Walks again, and the shadow slides, and a doubled line reads as a lifted leg set down. The illusion prefers darkness, not because sight is poor there, but because the field is controllable. A single flame in a black room carves a relief from shadow with precision no sunlit apron can match. In the Salon Noir at Nio, bison align with a vaulted ceiling whose curve loads the shoulders with mass. In Altamira, polychrome bison float on a pocked ceiling, where bulges become ribs when the lamp passes beneath. Elsewhere, engraved under drawings lie just beneath paint faint incisions that prove planning before pigment. These choices imply teaching novices can follow an incision fill a pre-dotted outline, then learn to shade by stumping with pads of hide or plant fibre, and to scrape highlights that mimic sheen on muscle. The mystery that persists is in tension's degree. Did artists consciously plan a moving sequence to be seen only in motion and early animation keyed to the frequency of flame? And did they rehearse a route and pace? Experiments suggest that flicker rates from torches and small lamps can make doubled lines fuse into apparent motion at certain distances, and that slight shifts in lamp height switch an image from one pose to another. Yet whether this effect is central or incidental remains open. Some overlapping outlines could mark correction or replacement by later hands rather than designed oscillation. Some placements on a relief may stem from a general preference for dynamic stone, rather than a precise optical scheme. Without text, the balance between deliberate illusion and emergent effect stays unresolved. Though the density of techniques twisted perspective, multiple limbs, relief, alignment, shading and scraping indicate sustained attention to how images behave under fire. The planetary frame sets the lighting and the pace of preservation. During glacial phases, sea levels fall and widen river mouths. Winds intensify and dust loads rise, shifting the chemistry of precipitation that feeds cave drip. Microclimates inside stabilize at high humidity and modest temperature, keeping pigments from thermal shock and slowing desiccation. Outside herds traverse open steppe tundra in arcs that can run hundreds of kilometers longer than the line from Prague to Paris. Inside air moves in slow pulses as outside temperature swings, drawing smoke towards ceilings, where soot maps visits in granular clouds. Over millennia, calcite veils the art drop by drop, sealing images, and in places softening edges so that a twice-drawn leg melts into a tremor of motion that may be stronger now than when fresh. Materials amplify illusion. Charcoal yields velvety blacks that swallow light. Manganese dioxide gives a denser, slightly reflective black that sparks under flame. Iron oxides range from orange to wine dark, depending on grain and heat. Painters exploit these differences. A matte outline sets the body. A denser black stacks for depth at the nostril and eye. A warm red underlayer glows through a thin dark inflecting tone like blood beneath skin. Scraping returns the walls pale, serving as highlight on withers and horns. Shallow pecking roughens areas that will hold more pigment. In a few places, fingertip striations feather edges to suggest fur. Where stone offers corrugations, artists rhythmically space short strokes along the ridges, When the lamp moves, each rib alternately catches and loses light, a shimmer, mistaken for breath. In narrow passages, painters compress bodies into available planes, learning from constraint that a few decisive curves suffice to carry species in motion. In high domes, they enlarge figures to volt scale and make the viewer lift the lamp, trading proximity for projection. A quiet observation sits in the geometry of horns and antlers. Twisted perspective is not a crude error, but a pragmatic convention to deliver maximum information in variable light. Two horns drawn as if seen from above but attached to a profile head keep both visible as the lamp moves, a solution still legible on pottery and manuscript margins tens of millennia later. Sound shares the room with light, and though this section rests on optics, the ear shapes what the eye believes. Painted zones often coincide with strong echoes so that a clap or chant sets a rhythm that paces the viewing, a metronome for the lamp's swing. Whether this pairing is aesthetic or ritual is unknown, but in practice it synchronizes bodies and flames, regularizing the illusion. The social pattern behind the panels emerges from residue pigment caches at fixed stations, grindstones with embedded ochre grains, used torches of juniper or pine discarded at thresholds, lampstones left with burned wicks curled like blackened grass. These objects imply rolls mixers, lighters, drawers, and instructions passed by demonstration. They also point to a norm of return rather than completion. Panels are revisited figures, retrace new lines added to old bodies, until the wall accrues a history of motions folded into one surface. If one asks what these illusions mean beyond their craft, the cautious answer is that they demonstrate a mind tuned to contingency. Images are built not as inert icons, but as performances depending on movement, perspective, and light. In a world where herds shift with weather and routes change with rivers, such a way of seeing stores flexibility. It teaches that the same lines deliver different animals as conditions change, that knowledge is relational. The ice that draws oceans down and the winds that rake the plains are the large rhythms within which this small theatre of fire and stone repeats. The planet adjusts coastlines by whole days' walk, yet underground a hand relights a lamp. A bison lifts its doubled foreleg, and a rhinoceros's horns argue again under a curve of limestone that remembers the first time it was chosen. They weigh the scenes against two persistent readings, records of prey and ritual maps of a spirit world, and find that the walls accept both possibilities without committing to either leaving the interpretation to move like torchlight over uneven stone. The fact that anchors this inquiry is simple and steady. Upper Paleolithic caves overwhelmingly depict animals with high anatomical care, while human bodies are rare and schematic and where humans appear. Lascaux's bird-headed figure beside a wounded bison in the shaft. The masked composite at Trois Frères. Their forms depart from naturalism that otherwise governs horses, bison, ibex, and rhinoceroses. This mismatch, paired with the frequent placement of paintings deep in hazardous chambers, suggests that the images are not inventories of daily meat, but belong to a system of meaning that exceeds subsistence. One line of thought holds that hunters come here to influence success, to capture an animal's essence by drawing its strongest lines to lodge a spear sign along a flank to rehearse a vital confrontation in safety, so that the body knows the gesture when ice and breath and distance conspire to make a shot difficult. Another line proposes that the cavern is a membrane between worlds, a place where echoes reply like voices and flicker makes a creature step forward from stone. In this reading, the painter negotiates with forces attached to animals and landforms, and the compositions work as conduits rather than records. A structuralist approach surveys species placement across caves and finds recurring pairings: horses versus bison, herbivores versus carnivores, animals of open ground versus animals of rough terrain, leading to the hypothesis of a grammar of oppositions that organizes panels. A cognitive approach notes the prevalence of grids, zigzags, ladders, and dots that resemble entoptic forms produced in the visual system under certain conditions, suggesting that the abstract signs could encode patterned experiences from trance or sensory stress. A third view treats the chambers as schools of image and sound where technique, posture, and animal knowledge pass between generations. Here the function is teaching, and ritual names the seriousness of that instruction rather than an appeal to invisible beings. Lesser-known details sustain each reading without closing the case. In Chauvet, a line of small footprints, likely a child's judged by stride and foot length, crosses a gallery with torch smears on the wall at shoulder height implying a guided visit. In several Spanish caves, red marks cluster where resonance peaks as if the hand found the wall's returning voice. At Trois Frères, fine engravings overlay and inflect painted bodies a palimpsest of re-entry. In Patagonia, stenciled hands form gradients from dense bands to loners drifting outward, a composition that looks like counting or rank without yielding its key. These particulars show planning and return rather than spontaneity. They speak of places used again and again in ways that mattered. The unresolved mystery remains meaning's content. Do the scenes narrate myth origin, flights, animal marriages, descent through rock whose words are lost while motifs endure? Do they depict social identities or intergroup compacts with species serving as emblems? Are they calendars that tie herds to seasons or constellations to valleys? Or are star readings an anachronism imposed by later eyes hungry for celestial maps? The evidence refuses to narrow superpositions can produce apparent stories, but dating single strokes is rarely possible. Acoustic hotspots align with paintings, yet a cause and effect chain cannot be forced. Ethnographies from later times and other continents, while suggestive, cannot safely be made into keys for Ice Age Europe or island Southeast Asia. The walls insist on plural readings that may have coexisted even for their makers. What is clear is investment. Pigments are prospected, carried ground, lamps are carved and fueled, paths are marked with soot dots. Panels are chosen for relief and sound. Figures are composed with underdrawings, stumping and scraping. Visits recur across centuries. Such expenditure sits awkwardly with a purely utilitarian ledger, unless one broadens utility to include the shaping of memory, identity and shared imagination. The planetary frame deepens this logic. During the late Pleistocene ice locks ocean water and drags coastlines outward. Winds harden, plains open, corridors of steppe link Iberia to far Eurasian interiors. Then interstadials soften the cold and water returns to carve and flood. Over spans longer than a single life, entire hunting grounds move by days of walking. A river the elders knew as broad dries to braided channels. A coastal shelf used for crossing becomes a sea. Against change on this scale, a cave affords stability. Temperature holds humidity, buffers echoes, persist and stone remembers. To return is to find a fixed point in a shifting world. A panel becomes a ledger of group time, an anchor that outlasts a migration longer than the line from Lisbon to Warsaw. In that context, hunting magic and spirit world may be two faces of the same practice to coordinate a group around images and sounds that compress memory and intention into a place that endures. Still, the caution stands meaning is not a single solution, and any account must tolerate ambiguity. Even the rare scenes resist fixed reading. The shaft panel at Lascaux aligns a bison with an apparent spear-like sign, a bird on a stick and a human figure with outstretched arms and a bird-like head. Whether this is a narrative of a hunt gone wrong, a ritualized event, a dream, or an emblematic tableau is unknown. Composite figures such as the masked sorcerer of Trois Frères could point to performers' spirits or metaphors for compound identities, or they could be the artistic answer to a rock-sock surface that asked for horns and a torso and a cloak at once. Abstract signs persist for millennia, with only modest change implying that they carry meanings robust enough to survive, yet no bilingual key appears on any wall. The prudent conclusion is to describe behaviours rather than declare doctrines. People select resonant places, manage firelight, learn species with precision, trace animals in relation to the stone's shape, repeat acts that bind participants to one another and to the chamber, and do so in climates that require constant adaptation outside. A quieter note often missed is how the paintings integrate different scales of attention. A viewer can stand back to see a herd sweep along a vault, then approach until the scrape that makes a horn's highlight becomes visible. Then step again until the stones pause and a single charcoal grain come into focus. Each distance offers a different meaning: communal spectacle, craft instruction, material intimacy. That layered viewing echoes layered time, old figures under calcite, fresh lines over old ribs, soot halos from last winter's lamp fused to a ceiling, stained by smoke 1,000 winters ago. In such conditions, asserting a single function would flatten what was likely a woven set: teaching, marking, remembering, supplicating, celebrating, initiating. The walls, patient as ice, quick as breath, receive all of it and keep only what stone and water allow. If the question asks which reading is true, the cave replies with a practical answer: truth. Here is a choreography of image, echo, flame, and return that sustains groups as landscapes shift. The animals serve not merely as prey nor solely as spirits, but as partners in thought, their bodies providing the stable, shareable forms upon which minds rehearse how to make the unseen intention memory belonging hold still long enough to pass from one generation to the next. They seek colour in the ground and learn to coax it from stone to grind earth, until it flows to nurse a flame, until black becomes a usable line. In this craft, the palette of caves is born not from rare substances, but from common minerals transformed by patience and heat. Red comes chiefly from iron oxides, hematite, and the hydrated goethite, yellow and orange from other iron-bearing clays, deep black from charcoal, or from manganese dioxide, white from scraped calcite or gypsum. The fact is steady and well-supported analyses of Paleolithic pigments repeatedly identify iron oxides, manganese minerals, and carbon as the primary colorants in European caves and in early figurative sites of island Southeast Asia. The work begins far from the panel. Someone identifies an outcrop where a seam of ochre breaks weathered rock into flaky plates or nodules. Someone else tests hardness, rubs a fragment on skin or stone to check covering power. The chosen lumps are carried back and reduced, pounded on grindstones, kneaded with water, saliva, or fat until the paste packs into small cakes that travel well and can be re-wet. A lesser-known detail glints in low-light specular hematite. A micaceous form sheds tiny reflective scales that catch a lamp's point like embers. Used as a dusting or underlayer, it imparts a subdued sparkle that a moving flame animates, without betraying the stone's quiet. Heat alters colour and behaviour. Goethite baked dehydrates to hematite and shifts toward richer red. Some ochres roasted become more hydrophobic and bind differently. Experiments and residue studies suggest that makers learn by repetition, which local ores brighten with heat and which turn dull. Charcoal seems simple, but its making us control slow smoulder in no oxygen yields a firm, dense black. Too much flame and the wood becomes ash that will not bond. Manganese dioxide can be dug from specific veins. Its presence in cave layers, sometimes far from natural deposits, marks purposeful collection. And there is a functional bonus debated among researchers: ground and sprinkled on kindling manganese dioxide can lower the ignition temperature of wood and aid for fire making in damp or cold conditions. Whether cave artists chose it primarily as pigment or also for its combustion chemistry remains an open question, but the dual utility would fit the economy of Ice Age practice. The planetary frame supplies both materials and preservative. During glacial episode, frost shatters cliffs and exposes fresh mineral faces. Lowered seas drain coastal shelves, opening routes to new sources and revealing river-cut ochre beds that will later drown. Windy, dust-rich atmospheres deposit fine iron-bearing particles over broad regions, while caves stabilize temperature and humidity so that once pigments reach the wall, they age slowly, protected from ultraviolet light and seasonal thermal shock. Over tens of millennia, calcite films condense veiling images drop by drop. In some places, the film preserves pigment like a lens. In others, it blurs edges into a soft haze that torchlight revives. The craft of preparation shades into teaching. Grindstones carry grooves and red residues. pestles blackened at the ends betray repeated pounding. Small caches of pigment cakes appear at panel thresholds. Lampstones, shallow limestone cups with soot at the rim, cluster at intervals as though assigned to viewing stations. Recipes differ by cave and time and are rarely explicit in the archaeological record, which leaves a durable mystery. Did painters consistently use binders beyond water or saliva? Animal fat marrow plant gums, and if so, in which combinations and for what effects? Chemical analyses sometimes fail to detect organics, whether because none were used or because they decayed. Occasional traces hint at fats or waxes, but not a universal formula. The absence of a single recipe fits the pattern the walls imply, a repertoire tuned to local materials explained in action, rather than codified in words. The palette's reach extends well beyond Europe. In Sulawesi and Borneo, Reds paint pigs and hand stencils with smooth cohesive edges that imply fine grinding and a wet application. In Patagonia, vast bands of hands bear black, red and white halos, with some sequences suggesting changes in pigment recipes across millennia. In Arnhem Land, later traditions include beeswax figures and mulberry hues, reminders that the global story of pigment becomes more varied through the Holocene. The deep prehistory of ochre precedes caves at South Africa's Blombos Cave. An ochre processing toolkit dating to around 100,000 years shows abalone shells used as containers, grindstones stained red and lumps of ochre intentionally abraded. At Sibudu compound, adhesives for hafting stone tools include plant gum tempered with ochre, an admixture that improves workability and moisture resistance, demonstrating a cognitive habit of combining ingredients for desired properties. When this habit enters caves, it meets geology's theatre and becomes image. Black and red behave differently under fire. Charcoal's matte softness swallows light, making a stable contour. Manganese black reflects more pinning, the viewer's attention on the eye nostril or horn tip, where lines concentrating black deepen space. Iron reds can underpaint and glow through subsequent black, giving warmth, as if blood or hide lay beneath. Draped highlights return the pale wall to mimic sheen. In polychrome panels like those at Altamira, the red underlayer and black outline collaborate with the swelling ceiling. Where the stone bulges, the red reads as saturated muscle. Where it dips, the same red falls into shadow, a trick that requires knowing the wall intimately before the first line is laid. Procurement scale matters. While many pigments lie within daily foraging ranges, some archaeological contexts show non-local minerals with sources tracked by trace element signatures tens of kilometers from the cave. A group might follow a river for several days farther than the line from London to Oxford to fetch a manganese-rich seam, whose black covers with the density a favoured animal requires, or to collect an ochre, whose binder affinity keeps a stencil's edge crisp in humid seasons. Such journeys fold pigment into social memory. The place of colour becomes a waypoint on an annual round, its path retold in the chamber where the colour will live longest. A quieter detail appears as microtext in the paint. Angular grains in a red layer signal freshly crushed ore. Rounded grains imply reused or long-weathered material. Tiny flecks of quartz or feldspar betray the grindstone's composition. Plant epidermal cells embedded in a film hint at a brushed application rather than blowing. Torches leave their own testimonies near the palette, stationed smears where the brand struck a wall. Scatters of spent blackened twigs in alcoves where mixers crouched. Soot dots that march like map points along a return path. The meaning of colour is the hardest problem. Red's association with blood and life in many ethnographies tempts easy projection. Black's connection to night and cave depth invites metaphor. Yet the record does not supply a key, and a sober reading keeps close to function, and habit colours help differentiate species and parts. Red ground under black warms a flank. Black alone carries a confident outline against pale limestone. White scraped from the wall itself lifts a horn or back into the lamp's path. Whether pigments carried layered symbolic values, clan markers, seasons, roles, must remain a possibility rather than a claim. Even without fixed meanings, the palette anchors group practice in technique. Children's finger flutings cross freshly painted bands, small hand stencils overlap large ones, a novice fills a dotted outline while an experienced hand composes a new shoulder along a bulge. Someone returns later to reassert a fading line with a fresher black, careful not to drown the red beneath. The collaboration of materials is visible where pigment ages. Iron reds deepen or darken with repeated wetting. Manganese blacks sometimes bloom with a metallic sheen after centuries. Charcoal can powder if laid too dry, but where a thin film of calcite bound early, it holds sharp. The cave's air, shaped by outside seasons, breathes over these films, cool, saturated currents in winter that condense on stone and brighten colours, warmer pulses that dry them back, and the paintings ride those cycles like live-in surfaces. On the planet's broader stage, ice deepens and retreats, shorelines lengthen, and then drown deserts pulse with dust, forests draw or loosen their canopy. Through it all, the palette persists because it is made of what the planet constantly makes. The ochre seam regenerates at an eroding cliff. The juniper grove offers new charcoal. The limestone ceiling sweats a fresh protective skin. That resilience is the palette's lesson colour in caves, is not a borrowed luxury, but a form of earth knowledge, a way to tune to local chemistry and light so that ideas endure as long as stone. The oldest paintings tell this quietly, that bodies of animals and traces of hands become visible only because people learn the slow behaviours of minerals, invent small repeatable recipes, and then match them to geology's shapes under a lamp that asks to be fed. What remains unknown, whether a given red signalled a season, a lineage, or a rite, does not unsettle what is clear colour. Here is attention solidified the mind's decision to make presents that will outlast breath by orders of magnitude measured not in years but in glacial beats. They listen as much as they look, and in the deep where light narrows to a circle, the wall answers voice and percussion with a character that feels as deliberate as any line. The cave becomes a theatre of sound in which image, echo, and flame share the same instrument. The fact that steady as this section is clear, surveys in several decorated caves show that paintings and engravings often cluster where echoes strengthen, or where the voice carries with unusual clarity, while undecorated stretches tend to coincide with acoustically dull zones. Researchers mapping resonance with humming or simple tones have noted that hand stencils, red dots, and animal panels frequently occupy positions at or near these sonic maxima. The method is humble and repeatable. A person walks and sings a stable pitch, listening for amplification, flutter echoes, or standing waves. At marked points, the wall seems to return the voice with greater power or with a beating that tracks distance and shape. Repeated measures at different times confirm that certain niches amplify and others absorb. A lesser-known detail lies in the percussive records some stalactites and thin draperies ring when struck, and streaks of pigment or soot smears appear on or near such features as though hands once tapped where sound bloomed. Elsewhere, faint peck marks cluster on resonant columns, a pattern consistent with lithophonic play rather than quarrying. The evidence does not claim concerts in the modern sense, only that stone's capacity to speak back matters for where images live. The choreography that sound imposes on movement is visible in residue. Lines of soot dots traverse corridors like a dotted staff marking a route by touch and sight. In larger chambers, torch smears recur at the same shoulder height at corners where echoes peak as if a bearer halted to listen before turning. Footprints in soft clay arc toward the centre of vaults with strong reverberation, then circle panels placed just off the loudest spot where words would dissolve into murmur. In such rooms, the flame metronomes, vision step, pause, lift the lamp, let a call settle into stone, then see an animal take its shape where the wall already speaks. The mystery remains function. Did makers test for echoes to choose places where instruction would carry so that names for muscles and tools reached a small audience without shouting? Did they seek acoustic coupling for ritual where a chant drum or clapped rhythm thickened the sense that stone responded? Or did they simply prefer lively rooms, because lively rooms made a better experience with no doctrine beyond enjoyment and emphasis? Multiple uses can coexist, and the record refuses to collapse into one. Sound also nudges technique. Where a vault booms, painters place animals along the curve that throws the voice back at the listener's chest. Where a corridor whispers, they line the path with stencils spaced like beats, guiding her return in the dark. In alcoves with focused echoes, they set small high-contrast figures that jump when seen by a lamp raised to the head. The correlation does not mean causation at every panel, but the frequency with which acoustically interesting places attract marks suggests a habit to test a wall with breath or tap before opening the pouch of pigment. The planetary frame keeps the acoustic steady, while the world outside changes by degrees of latitude. Glacial climates drive winds across continental interiors and pull shorelines hundreds of meters outward. Rivers lengthen and carve plains open and close, yet deep caves hold temperature within a narrow band and keep humidity high, conditions that stabilize both sound and pigment. A chamber's reverberation time depends on volume shape and surface absorption. Limestone, polished by a condensation and decorated with calcite skins, remains hard and reflective, so the clap of a hand in a grand hall carries nearly the same across millennia, while outside the same hand would meet tundra, then woodland, then rivermouth air. That stability turns sonic character into a durable property, a reason to return like a landmark held not by sight but by ear. The scale of these interiors can be large enough to make planning non-trivial. Some decorated zones lie hundreds of meters from the entrance, a distance that demands a supply of fuel, a chain of wayfinding marks, and a plan to manage smoke. In such reaches, the attraction of a room where a single voice fills a dome would be practical as well as effective, allowing communication without dispersing the group. Against that usefulness, caution stands. Not all decorated places are acoustically bright, and some highly resonant rooms are bare. Moreover, the same features that please the ear also please the eye: smooth curves, broad panels, dramatic relief. So the correlation may arise from shared selection for striking geology rather than from sound alone. The evidence is strongest when it registers microscale choices: a dot at the antinode of a standing wave along a wall, a panel centered just where a flutter echo extinguishes and returns as a single slap, a series of stencils arcing around a tight focus where a whisper blooms. Even then, the conclusion is tempered selection, for sound is plausible and sometimes likely, but the precise meanings of that selection ritual emphasis, teaching aid navigational cue, remain open. The social dimension of acoustics emerges in small things. Lampstones blackened on one rim suggest a habitual tilt that directs light forward and down, a posture that frees the mouth for singing or calling. Charred juniper and pine torches found near resonant chambers show repeated presence. Pigment caches at positions that hear one another over a gap indicate that voices coordinated work across space. Children's footprints among adult tracks in echoing galleries imply guided visits. In one case, a child's path crosses a zone with torch strikes high on the wall, as though an adult tested the room before leading the way. In instruction, sound becomes a scaffold. A repeated syllable holds attention, while a hand demonstrates shading. A clap cues the moment a figure moves as the lamp sweeps. Outside the planet's large cycles set a slow tempo that dwarfs any chant. Ice sheets advance and pull ocean away. Shelves emerge and carry travellers farther before the next crossing. Winds load the air with a dust that dulls light but leaves sound mostly untouched. Then warmth returns, sea reclaims ground, and roots redraw. Through these swings the cave's voice holds. A panel placed to answer a hum will still answer, long after river mouths have shifted by a day's walk. Echo thus joins calcite as a preservative of experience, not just of pigment. A quieter, lesser-noted detail links acoustics to breath-negative hand stencils at some sites, gather in rings around points where the voice focuses the halo of hands reading as a visual map of audibility. The centre left clear is where a singer might stand. Whether that arrangement designates a performer's place a teaching locus, or simply an experiment that pleased those present, is unknowable. It nonetheless suggests that listening shaped the composition. Another subtle trace is soot stratigraphy, thin distinct laminae. On ceilings above echo spots imply many short separate visits rather than a single long occupation. The layering fits periodic returns to resound the chamber, and perhaps add marks under similar sonic conditions. A final enigma concerns instruments. Bone flutes with finger holes from sites in Central Europe show that music exists in this time, but their direct association with painted chambers is rare. Percussive traces on stalactites and the ringing of columns attest to opportunistic instruments made of stone itself, yet whether sustained performance accompanied painting cannot be proven. The prudent reading is that sound mattered, and was used, but the forms it took are multiple and locally learned. In practice, the cave as a theatre of sound is less a claim about ceremony than a description of technique and place. People test walls, select panels where voice and echo align, arrange figures to catch not only light but also aural attention, and move through chambers in paths paced by acoustics as much as by relief. The effect is to bind memory to locations that answer back so that the body's own noise seals the lesson in stone. When the lamp lowers and embers die, the room falls again to its ambient note and the animals wait for the next breath to wake them. Outside, winds scrape ice across continents, seas retreat and return. But underground, the pitch of the chosen vault, the subtle beat along a corridor, and the halo of hands around a singing point remain a sonic architecture that holds meaning even when meanings shift. They notice what is missing even more than what is present. Animals sweep the chambers in confident lines while human bodies seldom appear, and when they do, the forms are reduced, masked, or fused with other creatures, as if people choose to speak of themselves indirectly by trace and sign rather than portrait. Across much of the Upper Paleolithic record, this pattern holds steady. The walls prize horses, bison, aurochs, ibex mammoths, rhinos and lions rendered with anatomical care. Yet human figures are few and rarely naturalistic, and the fact endures even in famous panels where a person stands among beasts at Lascaux. A bird-headed figure lies beside a wounded bison in the shaft at Trois Frères. A fine engraving shows a masked composited being with antlers and tail, and at Chauvet a stylized lower body with pubic triangle occurs near a feline head. A deliberate ambiguity that keeps the human hard to read. Hands by contrast are everywhere. As negative stencils, they anchor presence with biometric precision, finger lengths, palm breadth, small scars, but they do not resolve into faces. And so human representation leans toward emblem fragment and hybrid, rather than full portraiture, a choice that recurs in engraved caves such as Les Combarelles and Gabelou, where a handful of human forms appear among many animals, yet remain schematic. A lesser-known detail tightens the sense that human imagery belongs to special places and practices. Cusa Cave in the Dordogne carries hundreds of engravings including numerous stylized human figures and pubic triangles along kilometers of passage, and it also contains human burials placed inside alcoves during the Gravettian, an unusual pairing of imagery, and the dead inside a decorated system that suggests the human body, when shown or present, is bound to zones of particular importance rather than to the grand animal vaults. Another quiet trace of people appears as behaviour rather than depiction in Ruffignac, and elsewhere children's finger flutings run across soft films beside mammoths and bison, and small footprints mingle with adult tracks near panels, the record of participation without portrait that fits the broader reluctance to draw the self directly. The persistent mystery is why the human body is missing. Some scholars propose a prohibition, a rule against likeness that protects persons, avoids capture of essence, or maintains modesty. Others argue that the human is already implicit as maker and viewer, and need not be pictured, while animals form the shared vocabulary through which groups think and coordinate. Still others see a selective code in which people are represented by parts, the hand, the foot, the pubic triangle, or by composites that carry capacities from animals into the human frame without fixing any individual system flexible enough to travel across caves and centuries. A practical hypothesis joins these ideas without replacing them. Animals offer strong visual cues that a few strokes can unlock a mane, a hock, a horn's twist, while human faces demand a precision that risks caricature in dim, shifting light. On panels where makers erase and redraw scraped heads and abandoned torsos, suggests that failed attempts did occur and that the safe path led back to the animal body which the community could render with confidence. Planetary scale frames these choices. During the late Pleistocene, ice binds ocean water and lowers sea level by more than 100 meters. Continental shelves widen into plains, winds harden, and a steppe tundra belt arcs from Iberia into the far interior of Eurasia, carrying herds along corridors that can run farther than the line from Bordeaux to Berlin, while people follow with memory route markings and stories keyed to animals more than to persons. In such a world, to draw animals is to stabilize the moving landscape of survival and to attach group knowledge to forms everyone recognizes in the dark. Exceptions sharpen the rule rather than dissolve it. The Lascaux shaft tableau looks like narrative, but refuses a single reading Hunt-Wright dream emblem, because the figure is mask-faced and schematic, not an identifiable portrait. The composite at Trois Frères is half-hidden among a palimpsest of fine engravings, whose density reads as accretion of visits more than a moment captured. At Chauvet, a female lower body paired near a feline head sits in a cluster of powerful carnivores rather than among herbivores, a placement that complicates any simple code. And outside the painted walls, the ivory lion man of Hohensteinstadel, more than 40,000 years old, shows that minds of this period do imagine human-animal identities, but that such identities need not be documented as straightforward humans on cavestone. Even where human figures do occur, they lean toward ambiguity. Faces scarcely carry eyes. Limbs stretch or compress, genitals may be emphasized while other features vanish. Clothing is rarely shown, masks and tails appear more often than hair, and the viewer is left to decide whether a given body is a person, a performer, a spirit, or a metaphor. That ambiguity may be the point. A portrait would anchor one individual, but a hand stencil, a foot, or a pubic triangle can be inhabited by many people across time. A composite can carry speed, strength, or night sight into a human frame without settling claims about who exactly is shown. And an abstract sign can serve as a stable token in low light where fine facial detail would fail. The social pattern of placement supports this reading. Rare human figures tend to occupy thresholds and niches, deep pits, and acoustically striking corners, rather than the central vaults where herds dominate. The Lascaux figure lives down a shaft. Trois Frères' composite presides at a node in a maze of engravings, and at Cusack the human engravings' long flowing lines differ from compact animal contours as if marked by a distinct hand and function. Even when people are not drawn, the arrangement of signs implies human presence as guide and witness. Soot dot trails for return lampstones set at intervals. Pigment caches at positions that hear one another across a gap. The unresolved questions remain plain. Are the few naturalistic humans, special initiates, mourners, performers, or generic do-composite beings in code name myths? Or do they simply provide tools for thinking with animal capacities attached to human roles? Did rules about depicting people vary widely between groups? Or does the archaeological sample hide now vanished local traditions where portraiture was more common? Current evidence cannot decide. What it shows consistently is investment in animals and in human signs that avoid full likeness. The lesser-known difficulty is technical and cognitive at once, drawing a convincing human face with a few bold strokes under flickering flame may be far harder than drawing a convincing bison, and a community that prizes dependable teachable marks will gravitate toward forms that work in variable light. To that end, a grammar of animal bodies, hands, pubic triangles, and recurring abstract signs offers robust components that survive torch drift, condensation, and distance. Against the planet's long rhythms, ice advancing and retreating coasts, marching outward, then flooding back deserts, breathing dust into the sky. The chambers hold steady temperature and high humidity, and the system of representation travels well inside this microclimate. Animals provide the shared atlas signs, carry people by implication, and the few human bodies that appear do so, where stone and sound already announce a place apart. In this way, the missing human shape becomes a choice rather than a lack, a way to place persons into the art as makers, viewers, teachers, mourners, and singers without fixing any one face so that knowledge, rather than identity, persists. When the lamp lowers, the hand halo remains crisp. The bison still leans into the curve. The composite still hovers between kinds, and the people themselves walk out with the wick leaving the system intact to receive the next generation under the same steady rock and the same slow breath of the earth. They begin to read the walls not only for bodies, but for the marks that travel with them. Dots that cluster and trail, zigzags that tighten into hatching, chevrons, lattices, ovals and triangles, ladders with uprights and rungs, signs that do not imitate an animal, yet keep appearing beside animals across caves and centuries, as if the grammar of pictures includes a quiet, abstract vocabulary. The fact that steady as this section is secure, recurrent geometric motifs accompany figurative art throughout the Upper Paleolithic, and some of these forms persist for millennia, and reappear across wide regions, while yet older engraved pieces from Africa cross-hatched ochre at Blombos around 100,000 years ago, and patterned ostrich eggshell containers at Diepkloof in the range of 60 to 59,000 years show that deliberate geometric marking is an ancient habit that precedes the famous painted chambers. On the cave wall, the abstract signs occupy positions that feel chosen. A short ladder tucks beneath a bison's chest, a field of dots skirts a horse's shoulder, a sequence of chevron stacks near a fissure, and in some panels a single oval or vulvar shape sits where the rock offers a natural recess. They are drawn with the same care as animals, incised with sharp stone into thin calcite films, brushed in charcoal blown in red with the same reed tubes used for hands, or pecked to roughen a patch before pigment binds. A lesser-known detail hides in the mechanics of incision on soft moon-milk powdery calcite that coats limestone fingertips and flint leave distinct textures. Under lamplight, the burr of a fresh cut throws a bright line, while an older incision, dampened and re-dried, dulls to grey. In several caves, the alternation of bright and dull within a single cluster suggests that signs were refreshed over time, a maintenance of the abstract lexicon that parallels the retracing of animal outlines. The question that will not resolve is function. Do these marks count seasons or herds map paths through a caste network? Name people or groups, index stories that no longer have words, or stand as teaching aids for how to build complex images from simple units? Some researchers see in grids, zigzags and ladder-like forms the entoptic shapes that the human visual system produces under stress trance, or sensory deprivation patterns that a maker might then stabilize on stone. Others note the slow continuity of particular motifs across thousands of years and propose that they serve as durable tokens for ideas, place-event taboo role, passed from one generation to the next. The evidence bears both readings without forcing a verdict. The same chevron can look like a tally, a ripple, a sign for a valley, or an echo of a phosphene. The same ladder can be a map of niches or a frame for counting. Only the habit of repetition is certain. The planetary frame gives these signs their scale. During glacial swings that drop sea level by more than 100 meters, extend the continental shelves and open plains where maps once showed water, people move along corridors that may stretch farther than the line from Lisbon to Warsaw. Under such distances and changes, a compact set of repeatable marks would travel well. Teachable, recognizable in low light, robust to the flicker of flame and the curve of stone. That portability does not imply a single origin or a fixed dictionary. Rather, it reflects how abstraction condenses experience. In one valley, a triangle might tag a spring. Across mountains, the same triangle might cue a story. Over centuries, its position relative to a horse or to a fissure might matter as much as its shape, so that reading depends on place, panel, and practice. Technique binds the system to rock. On hard limestone, a sign's outline is cut first and then darkened, with charcoal rubbed into the groove. On softer films, a finger alone suffices to draw a zigzag that feels glossy at first and then soon mattes as condensation dulls the ridge. On crumbly surfaces, pecking roughens a bed to take a wash of red that otherwise would run. Where a wall bulges a lattice can bend to follow the curve, hinting that the sign's geometry lives with the rock's anatomy. Where a crack runs dots across it, like footsteps turning a structural fault into a line of meaning. In some caves, strings of paired dots march towards deeper chambers, as if marking waypoints. In others, the densest sign clusters hang near acoustically bright spot echoing the section where voice and wall converse. The lesser-known detail of portability appears outside caves to engraved plaquettes. Small flat stones carried and worked in the open bear the same zigzag chevrons and grids along with rapid animal sketches. Their edges show polish from handling their surfaces, the noise of many light cuts as if a person rehearsed a motif before committing it to the wall, or carried a compact reference of signs and poses. Another quiet trace sits in the ostrich eggshell containers from Deep Kloof, repetitive bands of hatching and punctures wrap vessels used to store and carry water. Whether these bands mark ownership content or route is unknown, but their regularity and placement imply social meaning beyond decoration. The great mystery, whether any of this is proto-writing, does not admit a clean answer. Writing in the strict sense encodes language at a level that preserves arbitrary sequences of speech. The Upper Paleolithic sign sets do not show such clear mapping between form and sound. Yet they do show conventionality and recombination, a limited inventory placed in repeatable relations with animals, cracks, and chambers. Patterns that persist long enough to be learned and taught. Motifs complex enough to bear more than one meaning, and simple enough to draw under a lamp. It may be truer to say that these are stable symbols in a system oriented to place rather than to sentence. They make caves legible to participants, turn panels into anchors for memory, and give groups a means to coordinate knowledge when the ground itself shifts with ice and sea. The social choreography that keeps the signs alive can be read at panel scale. An experienced hand often lays the animal. A second hand dots a margin or adds a short ladder. A child's finger fluting crosses the sign and the flank in confident, playful waves. Later, someone returns to darken a rung or add a chevron, where a new crack suggests the need. The density of abstract marks near thresholds hints at instruction. Portable motifs taught where groups assemble before moving deeper, while the appearance of certain signs far inside suggests functions tied to specific chambers. Even in richly animalled caves there are walls where only signs gather, as if the room's purpose were to hold the index rather than the story. Climate threads through all of this as quietly as a binder through pigment. When cold intensifies, condensation coats walls more often, and moon milk grows, inviting finger-drawn lines. When warmth returns and drip rates drop, incisions cut cleaner and stay bright longer. Glacial winds load the cave mouth with dust, dulling some whites, but deep chambers preserve the contrast that abstract signs require. The same cycles that drive herds and routes reshape panels slowly, and with each reshaping the sign system shows its resilience. A ladder can be redrawn a little higher as dripstone grows, a grid can shift around a new fracture, a field of dots can expand into a fresh alcove discovered when a slab falls. If one asks what these marks tell about the mind, the cautious answer is that they show comfort with reduction, turning complex animals into a few lines, turning events into tokens, and with relational thinking placing a sign relative to rock image and path so that position carries part of the meaning. They show a pedagogy of small repeatable elements that become larger compositions. They show that abstraction is not a late luxury but a partner to depiction from the start. And they suggest something planetary in scope across continents, and changing coasts groups that never meet still converge on a shared suite of workable forms: zigzag, dot, ladder, lattice, because the human eye and hand, the lamp and the limestone, the needs of memory and movement pose the same problems and invite the same solutions. In the end, the signs are quiet. They wait beside horses and bison, beside cracks and pools, beside voices that test the wall, and they hold their meanings with enough ambiguity to travel through time intact. Whether they counted winters marked kin, taught beginners, or mapped the unseen, they remain a small, resilient vocabulary by which the first imagination names its world without requiring a face or a sentence. They learn together in the dark, and the walls keep the record of instruction as clearly as of art, small hands beside large, faint incisions that set a path for later paint, retraced outlines that show correction footprints of children mingled with adults near panels and lamp stones set at steady intervals where a teacher might have paused to speak and a learner to watch. The fact that steadies this section is simple and material. Multiple caves preserve evidence of mixed-age participation and staged working, children's finger flutings etched into soft calcite films at reachable heights, small and large hand stencils overlapped in clusters, underdrawings incised before pigment caches and grindstones at threshold stations and ceilings with figures so high that scaffolding is widely inferred from sockets and wear marks as at Lascaux, where the polychrome bison vaults could not be reached from the floor. Finger fluting studies compare groove widths and spacing to identify contributors of different sizes. Some tracks match adult spans, others fall within juvenile ranges, implying that instruction and play blur into practice at the panel edge. Lesser-known details hide in the periphery narrow ledges below decorated zones, bear repeated scorch streaks at shoulder height as though lamps were habitually set there during work. Grindstones with embedded red grains lie cached at the mouths of deeper corridors, suggesting mixing stations where pigment was readied before a group moved on. In a few chambers, dotted outlines, regularly spaced points form ghost figures that later strokes connect a technique that turns a complex contour into a sequence a novice can follow. The choreography of teaching becomes visible when the room is walked as they likely walked it. A party enters with fuel and tools. One person tests the wall's echo and the lamp's reach. Another lays a shallow incised path along a chosen ridge. Pigment is dampened and kneaded until it holds a bead on the reed or brush. The lamp is placed on a flat stone with its wick trimmed to a steady flame, and the learner hand pressed against the rock blows pigment in a halo that reveals both the wall's texture and the anatomy of the hand that did it. Stencils multiply in arcing bands at heights reachable without climbing. Above them, where the surface bulges into bulls or horses, confident outlines in charcoal and manganese announce experienced hands. The unresolved mystery concerns roles and transmission. Did certain people specialize as image makers across seasons, traveling between groups and caves, or did most adults possess enough skill to teach local children and newcomers as part of ordinary life? Were there episodes of instruction bound to specific times, initiation seasons, return visit rites, or was learning opportunistic a byproduct of maintenance and freshening of panels that a community already used? The evidence supports both structure and flexibility. Long-lived sign traditions suggest conventional teaching, while the presence of youthful flutings amid masterful animal bodies implies moments when curiosity was admitted into the most formal spaces. The planetary frame sets this pedagogy against change so large that only durable practice can bridge it. As ice locks, water and sea levels fall by more than 100 meters, coastlines extend and river mouths march outward by days of walking, where winds intensify and a steppe tundra belt sweeps from Iberia deep into Eurasia, drawing herds along corridors sometimes longer than the line from Madrid to Copenhagen. Then interstadial's warm water returns, shelves drown and roots redraw. Under these oscillations, caves hold temperature near constant, humidity high and acoustics stable. They become classrooms whose architecture persists while the world outside reconfigures. The return to a panel after 5 years or 50 meets the same curve, the same echo, the same scrapable calcite film, a stability that makes long training feasible even when camps and hunting grounds shift. Evidence for method accumulates at small scales. On several walls, incised guidelines lie just beneath paint, their shallow burrs catching light where pigment thins. On others, scraped highlights suggest a 3-step lesson. Draw shade, then lift light by removing the thin, darkened skin to reveal pale limestone. In polychrome bison, a red underlayer fits the swelling of the ceiling, so that later black can ride its shoulder. Teaching here includes the geology itself, read the rock. Then place the line, a principle legible in the way contours track ridges and bellies settle into concavities. On soft moon milk films, flutings in parallel sets that show that fingertips were used to train a steady, evenly spaced stroke. Some sets are low and wide, consistent with small arms stretched up, others at adult height, perhaps demonstration lines for imitation. A quiet telling detail sits in toolware. Crayons of ochre rounded on one end, flattened on the other, bare polish, and microstriations from repeated rubbing. Their cross-sections vary from fine tips to blunt ovals, a portable palette that allows a teacher to escalate a task from filling a dotted outline to defining a shoulder with a single continuous stroke. Bone or reed tubes where they survive with pigment residue point to instruction in breath control edges of stencils crisp where the hand seals well feathered, where the wall is uneven. Novices learn to press and adjust to test for leaks with a small preliminary burst before committing to a full halo. Scaffolding, though perished, leaves its logic on high ceilings. At Lascaux and other vaulted sites, the distribution of figures and the neatness of outlines on domes imply stable working platforms. Where on floor stones beneath suggests repeated ascent and descent, soot accumulates in ceiling pockets where lamps likely sat, while work shifted a scaffold's position. Teaching on a platform requires coordination. One person steadies the light, one applies the line, another passes pigment, a triad that rehearses roles and timing as much as draftsmanship. The social dimension of learning emerges not only in production, but in viewing. Acoustic hotspots near decorated panels distribute voices so that a small audience can hear without strain. Soot dots along returning routes mark a path for a group to review new work. Footprints of different sizes cluster at stations in echoing halls, a map of attention where instruction likely changed from demonstration to discussion. Whether these gatherings were formal or improvised stays unknown. What can be said is that the architecture of caves curves to draw ledges to sit lamps. Resonant spots to speak affords teaching modes that leave residue even when words and gestures have vanished. The lesser-noted link between material and memory appears in maintenance. Over centuries, outlines are retraced. Faded reds revived under fresh black sign fields extended around new cracks, and this maintenance itself is pedagogy to restore, is to study, to feel the old line, and to understand why it lies where it does. Where calcite veils a figure, someone may redraw it, fractionally offset on the new surface, preserving composition while accepting geological change. The result is a palimpsest that binds generations across deposits measured in millimetres, but in time perhaps in lifetimes. The unresolved questions extend to identity. Finger ratio studies on hand stencils have been used to propose sex distributions for contributors, sometimes suggesting many female makers. Later critiques caution that such methods are noisy and population-specific. The prudent reading is inclusive men, women and children all leave marks. Skill is teachable to any who persist, and roles may have varied by group season or chamber. Another open question is whether specific abstract signs were tied to teaching sequences, first dots and lines, then ladders and chevrons, or whether learners began with animals through tracing. The layered evidence allows both dotted guides under animal bodies look like exercises, while sign-only walls near entrances feel like primers. Across the glacial arc, this quiet schooling scales with movement. A group that crosses mountains to a manganese vein or follows a river by a week's walk to an ochre bed returns to a known chamber to incorporate the new material into its repertoire. Pigment procurement becomes part of the curriculum, a lesson in geology and route finding that ends at a wall where those skills are turned into line. The planet delivers change in coastlines and climate. The cave offers continuity. Teaching binds them by converting local minerals, stable acoustics, and stone relief into techniques that persist. The mind that emerges here as communal and iterative knowledge passes by hand on rock by breath, through a tube by the steady trim of a wick. Errors are scraped away, successful moves are retraced, and every return composes a classroom out of echoes and light. When the lamp is lifted down and the wick smokes into quiet, the panel holds both art and method, and outside as ice and sea redraw the world. Those who learned under one teacher's lamp can find another room with a similar curve. Set a stone lamp in the same way, press a hand and blow, and see the same crisp halo appear, an old lesson renewed in a place that feels even after years and distances like the right wall to begin again. They work together across years and then across centuries, returning to the same bends and vaults until the wall becomes a ledger of shared attention. Layers accumulate, figures are retraced, Signs are refreshed and pigment sources recur, as if a community's choices harden into custom. The fact that steady as this section is clear and coherent, one famous cave Chauvet contains at least two major phases of art separated by roughly 5,000 years, with Aurignacian images around 36,000 years ago, and later Gravettian work near 31,000 a span, demonstrated by the radiocarbon dates on the charcoal drawings and torch smears. The cave thus proves that a decorated chamber can be re-entered long after the first makers and used again with respect for earlier panels rather than erasure. The surface itself records the etiquette of return. Earlier animals lie under thin calcite films whose gloss softens outlines. Later hands add figures beside or over them, without destroying their legibility, placing new lions along a ledge already heavy with felids, redrawing a bison's shoulder. Where the ceiling's bulge still carries the right mass, extending a run of dots around a fresh fracture that opened after a ceiling flake fell. Palimpsest becomes a method to add is to converse with what is there. A lesser-known detail speaks of shared presence in a single visit long after the first painting Chauvet preserves the footprints of a child moving through a gallery, and beside them the paw prints of a large canid. Whether the animal is a wolf or an early dog remains debated, but the pairing fixes a moment of companionship in the deep zone, and reminds that collaboration includes movement, light, and safety as well as drawing. Elsewhere, collaboration reads as logistics. Caches of pigment reappear in predictable niches. Grindstones with embedded red grains accumulate at the same thresholds. Lampstones blackened on one rim repeat at viewing stations spaced by a few body lengths, suggesting a choreography that later parties reproduce. On high ceilings, neat outlines and even shading imply scaffolds or platforms rebuilt in similar positions across visits. Tiny wear pits in floor stones beneath these vaults mark the seance where a support was set again and again. The unresolved mysteries concern how groups understood authorship and access. Did certain lineages hold rights to particular chambers? Did visitors from distant valleys add under supervision? Did later hands know the meanings of older signs or respond to them with new senses? Was there an explicit intent to preserve earlier images? Or did geological caution, soft films, dripping calcite naturally discourage scraping and encourage working around what existed? The material record cannot answer directly. It shows respect in restraint, but whether that respect is rule, reverence, or practicality is unknown. It also shows continuity of technique that implies teaching lineage under drawings incised before paint remain consistent in style. Shading by stumping and highlight by scraping appear in both early and late phases. Choices of panels track relief with the same eye for shoulders and bellies. Collaboration scales beyond the chamber's walls when materials travel. Geochemical fingerprints of manganese and ochre at some sites match sources tens of kilometers away, implying either seasonal forays or exchange. The repeated use of a particular black that covers densely hints at a shared preference or a social requirement. This is the right black for lions in this cave carried across time. A quieter collaborative trace sits at the centimetre scale, where a later artist retraces an earlier outline. Microscopic ridges show two episodes of pressure and a slight offset that respects the earlier line's arc. Even correction is a delicate partnership, the second hand shadowing the first rather than overwriting it. The planetary frame sets these practices against climates that change faster than stories fade. Between the Aurignacian and Gravettian, at Chauvet temperature, and moisture shift with stadials and interstadials, winds strengthen and then slacken. Sea level continues its glacial descent. Steppe tundra advances and retreats in belts that can move hundreds of kilometers farther than the line from Laon to Frankfurt within the span between phases. Herd ranges, river courses, and coastlines redraw, yet the cave's interior holds steady humidity and cool air. Its echoes remain. Its relief still offers the same shoulder ridge, the same concavity for a belly, the same pocket for a lamp. That stability lets a community meet itself across generations in a space that stays recognizably theirs even as routes to reach it alter. Collaboration also means role division at each return. One person scouts air and drip, another prepares pigment, one tends lamps trimming wicks so flames do not smoke, one draws, Children press hands or run fingers through soft films at the margin. Singers or callers test the room's voice so the group moves in a rhythm that keeps light and attention synchronized. Torch smears at recurrent shoulder heights show where a bearer halted to watch. Clusters of soot dots at junctions map the agreement about how to exit. Used torches of pine or juniper gather in alcoves like punctuation at the ends of sessions. On some panels, dotted guides beneath confident outlines show a teaching episode that culminates in a masterstroke. On others' sign, walls near entrances thicken over time, as if each return added a rung to a local ladder, or an extra chevron to a lexicon that seniors recited to juniors before the party went deeper. Lesser noted evidence for collaborative time lies in the layered soot on ceilings. Thin laminars separated by clean stone imply many short visits rather than one long occupation. Where these laminae concentrate above particular panels, they function as an attendance record for that spot, a stratigraphy of regard as much as of smoke. Collaboration in caves extends to animals that are no longer present outside. In chambers heavy with felids later, artists still draw lions with the same muscular economy as earlier ones, even as local populations shift with climate. This fidelity suggests that conventions, how to carry a lion's back on a ledge, where to thicken the muzzle, are stored in practice as well as in observation handed down as rules of placement and stroke. A related enigma is whether different groups meeting at a cave contributed distinct styles that scholars might someday tease apart by microtrace and gesture, or whether the weight of convention and the authority of place homogenized hands into a house style. For now, the panels show variation within constraint. A bison's hump swells more here, a horse's muzzle narrows there, but the grammar holds. Outside, the planet's long rhythm continues. Ice sheets grow lock ocean water and draw coasts far outward. Shelves become plains. Rivers incise new paths. Then warmth returns and sea reclaims ground. The distance a group must travel to reach a favoured cave stretches and shrinks by days of walking over a lifetime. Collaboration adapts to these changes by building routes into memory soot dots as breadcrumbs in rock pigment caches, as promises to future selves, and by turning the cave into a social anchor that outlasts camps. In that sense, the decorated chamber functions as a technology of memory larger than any individual one that holds agreements about look placement and conduct. It is a commons where many hands keep a single surface coherent over immense time, a place where a child's small stencil can sit beside a lion, drawn centuries earlier without discord. The mind visible here is distributed. It lives in rules for lamp height and preferences for a certain black in the habit of aligning a back to a ridge in the path of soot marks that steer feet along returns. It lives as well in restraint, the decision not to cover an older figure, even when space is tight, and in invention, the choice to bend a ladder sign around a new crack so it continues to read as itself. The collaborations of firestone, pigment, and echo remain constant. The collaborations of people change names and faces, but keep the same shapes. When the lamp is lowered and the party leaves their work fits without seam into a surface already aged by dripping water and earlier breath, and when another party returns after a winter of winds or a generation of shifting herds, the cave gives back the same cool air and the same curve, ready to receive another layer in a conversation that measures its length not by lifetimes but by the slow growth of calcite across a line. They choose the dark not because daylight fails them, but because the chambers beyond daylight answer needs that surface places cannot. The descent is deliberate, repeatable, and costly, and the record of cost sits everywhere in soot, halo ceilings, where air pulls in wayfinding dots that mark the return through featureless bends in lampstones blackened on one rim because the flame is always tilted forward in polished rock at tight squeezes, where hands and shoulders pass again and again. Hazards attend every step. A torch brightens, then gutters where the cave exhales stale air. In low pockets, carbon dioxide accumulates until breath shortens and flames fade. Water pools into cold that numbs fingers. Floors tilt into hidden voids. Disorientation sets in when a lamp goes out and silence erases direction. Yet people come bearing fuel and pigment, and they stay long enough to choose panels, test echoes in size guides, paint animals, and set signs a constellation of tasks that ask for planning roles and trust. The fact that steadies this section is visible in two places that bookend the time span at Brunequel in southern France, long before famous painting-broken stalagmites were arranged into circular structures more than 300 metres from the entrance, around 176,000 years ago, with reddened zones and burnt bone marking controlled fire in the deep. In Cosquer Cave near Marseille, decorated between roughly 27 and 19,000 years ago, the accessible entrance once lay inland and above the sea, but today it sits 37 metres below sea level, at the end of a flooded tunnel about 175 metres long, a planetary afterword that proves how far makers once penetrated and how greatly coasts have moved since. Both places insist on intention-deep zones are entered to do something that matters. A lesser-known detail binds intention to technology at Lamouth and other Upper Paleolithic sites. Portable sandstone lamps with charred fat residues, likely from ruminant tallow or marrow, have been recovered. Their shallow basins soot-polished on the rim, some bearing engraved figures on the handle, evidence that light itself is a crafted tool with its own repertoire of forms and uses. Paired with juniper or pine torches for travel, the lamps steady the working flame while torches carry a quick, brighter fire through corridors. The reasons for choosing darkness remain the enduring mystery. Explanations range and overlap the cave as a theatre where image and echo fuse, the cave as a boundary where beings of rock and flesh meet, the cave as a classroom where technique and names for animals are taught out of weather, the cave as an archive where a group checks its memory against earlier layers, the cave as a place of initiation, count oath or healing, the cave as a compass in a world whose coasts and river mouths shift by the distance of many days walking within a lifetime. The record refuses to collapse to one reading, and prudence holds to behaviour rather than doctrine. People accept risk and pay the cost of time, fuel and comfort to make marks that outlast their breath by spans measured in calcite growth. The planetary frame explains both motive and preservation. During glacial maxima, sea level drops by more than 100 metres, unveiling shelves and extending coasts. Corridors of dry land link islands across the Sunda Shelf, winds sharpen and carry dust far inland. Karst develops new voids as water chemistry shifts with climate. Then interstadials, warm sea reclaims ground, and entrances drown. Cosquer's submerged approach is not an anomaly, but a visible remnant of this cycle. A chamber once inland and dry now receives divers through salt water into a hall where hand stencils, animals and signs remain crisp under a film of calcite. Inland, the same climate swings change routes to caves by tens of kilometres, so that a party's approach in one generation is a day longer or shorter in the next. Yet inside temperature stays nearly constant and humidity high, preserving both pigment and the acoustic character that contributes to the experience of a room. That stability is part of the choice. A cave holds steady while river courses braid and unbraid, while coastlines march outward and back while herds shift their calving grounds. To descend is to step into a time that moves slower than weather, and memory a pace suitable for preserving agreements about images and methods. The logistics of chosen darkness are systematic. Wayfinding dots, small soot marks set at intervals, trail along passages clustered near junctions like punctuation. Torch smears occur at consistent heights at turning points where a bearer halts to look and listen. Caches of pigment cakes sit in predictable niches near thresholds and reappear through time, their edges worn by fingers. Grindstones with embedded red grains lie where a group prepares paste before moving deeper. Scaffolding is inferred from the even reach of figures on high vaults, and from small floorware pits beneath which readers the sockets of supports set and reset across visits. Footprints add voices. Adult and child's tracks mingle in damp clay near decorated zones, and strings of small prints sometimes curve toward acoustically bright places and then away as if guided. The choreography suggests roles: scouts for air carriers, for fuel mixers, for pigment tenders of lamps, drawers, singers or callers to test a room's voice in a sequence that repeats until it becomes custom. The chosen deep also disciplines technique. In tight spaces, A lamp's low flame flattens contrast and forces a reliance on strong outlines and scraped highlights. In domed halls, a raised lamp throws grazing light that exaggerates relief and invites twisted perspective and multiple limbs. In very humid pockets, films of moon milk accept finger flutings and soft incisions that a brush would smear. Makers learn to read microclimates and match methods to them. Blow a stencil where the surface is slightly rough to catch grains. Incise a guide where drip gloss will preserve the burr. Avoid painting directly under active drips that will scour pigment. Place a bison's shoulder on a convexity to let shadow supply volume. These are lessons of survival as much as of art, because every extra minute underground costs fuel and air. Beyond the problems of air and return water itself produces boundaries. Sumps seal off chambers in wet phases, then open in drier spells, and a panel's accessibility can oscillate over centuries, turning at a place of periodic work into one of long silence, and then again into a place of return. That rhythm fits the slow growth of calcite that slowly veils images, until generations later a fresh skin invites a careful retracing slightly offset from the original. Dark and time together generate the palimpsests that earlier sections read as collaboration across centuries. Another quiet detail that deepens choice lies in the pairing of sound and darkness in several systems. Hand stencils and dot fields gather where echoes peak or where a whisper blooms. Placement that favours voice tested by a lamp underlines a preference for rooms that respond as if the cave's reply were part of the reason to be there. None of these behaviours proves a doctrine. All of them together describe a craft invested in places that must be sought rather than stumbled upon. The scale of some penetrations underscores commitment without modern comparison in multiple decorated caves. Significant panels lie hundreds of meters from daylight through contorted passages that require crawling or single file. In Kosker, the present-day submerged tunnel runs longer than a city block before opening to the chambers, and in Bruniquel the stalagmite circle sits so far from the entrance that the journey itself is part of the work. Seen against the planet's long beats, the decision to choose darkness reads as a way to anchor thought and social memory in a medium rock. Water, an echo that moves at geologic speed. It trades ease for permanence, risk for continuity. When the lamps are finally pinched out and the last brand smears a black comma on the wall at a junction, the chamber returns to its slow breath. Sea rises or falls, rivers change course, ice advances or retreats, and above ground campfires shift by seasons. But below the wall keeps the animal stepping forward and the hands haloed, waiting for another small procession to choose the dark again and rehearse what a group knows about line sound and the patience of stone. They gather the questions that refuse to settle and set them in order not to solve them, but to see where knowledge ends and inference begins. The caves help by keeping what stone can keep and by losing what stone will not hold. The first uncertainty concerns authorship at the edge of modern human arrival in Europe. Calcite skins dated by uranium-thorium methods in several Iberian caves yield minimum ages older than 64,000 years for red disc stencils and a ladder-shaped motif implying Neanderthal makers if the stratigraphy and detrital thorium corrections are sound. The fact is that these measurements exist and are repeatable in some samples. Yet a careful debate persists over contamination microstratigraphic context, and whether all dated crusts truly overlie pigment rather than adjacent rock. A second uncertainty concerns meaning across systems that look consistent but may not be the same abstract signs. Dots, ladders, chevrons, lattices span thousands of years and wide regions, but no concordance ties them to fixed concepts. A sign that marks a spring in one valley might cue a story elsewhere, and a field of dots can be counting sound mapping, or simply a way to build tone. A third concerns who within communities makes the mark studies that infer sex from finger-length ratios on stencils or from finger fluting suggest varied participation, sometimes with many female contributors. Critics note population variability and measurement error, leaving a prudent conclusion that adults and children of different sexes contribute without a clear quota. Another open problem sits in chronology panels. Our palimpsest strokes, overlap, and radiocarbon dates on charcoal drawings give ranges that rarely separate individual lines. In polychrome or manganese black figures, radiocarbon is impossible, and uranium-thorium dates only bracket episodes by the ages of calcite skins before or after. Pigment mönningbra daisko. Two broad phases, so the lesser-known detail that complicates all of this is modern touch. Early visitors brought soot torches and sometimes even pencils. Conservation glues and tracing foils left residues, skin oils and breath-altered fragile films. These traces can skew dates and surface chemistry, which is why the higher standards now require microsampling under magnification, pre-screening for contaminants, and when possible dating of multiple nested calcite laminae to confirm order. The planet itself enforces the largest uncertainty by erasing most of what once existed. During glacial maxima, sea level drops more than 100 meters, exposing continental shelves and long coastal plains where people likely sheltered and worked. When ice retreats, sea reclaims those shelves and drowns entrances, as at Koska, where a decorated cavern now lies behind a flooded tunnel, 37 meters beneath modern sea level. The planetary observation is that a vast portion of Paleolithic coastal art and habitation zones now lie underwater, and with them any comparative record that might have shown whether deep cave practice mirrored a richer coastal repertoire. Preservation on land is no kinder outdoor rock art weathers, sandstone sloughs, and only the buffered interiors keep a long record. The archive is thus biased toward caves in specific lithologies and climates, leaving whole regions underrepresented. A further mystery surrounds geography of innovation versus convergence. Hand stencils with breath-blown halos appear in Europe Island, Southeast Asia, Australia, and South America. Figurative animals with confident contours rise in multiple continents. Geometric motifs converge on a small workable set. Are these the result of diffusion along ancient corridors, or are they independent solutions constrained by the human body, limestone walls, and lamplight? The simplest reading is that both operate bodies and stones pose the same problems, so parallel invention is natural, while contact across moving frontiers adds borrowed habits. Distinguishing the two without texts will remain difficult. The function of deep chambers resists narrowing for similar reasons. Evidence fits teaching, remembrance, initiation, healing, hunting, rehearsal, spirit, negotiation, placemaking, and sound play. Each has testable correlates, echo hotspots, pigment caches, scaffold logic. Dotted guides are human figures in thresholds, and all appear in different mixes. A single doctrine is unlikely, and the caution is to describe behaviour rather than impose a purpose. Even the choice of species stays partly opaque. Horses and bison dominate many European panels, while reindeer, a dietary staple in some periods, often recede. Carnivores receive attention disproportionate to their appearance in bone heaps. In Sulawesi, suids and small bovids prevail. Explanations range from aesthetics of mass and curve to emblematic systems, to prey, forecasting, to narratives now lost. The temptation to project star maps or calendars onto walls is strong, but direct evidence remains thin. Where alignments are proposed, independent confirmation is rare. Technique has its own unanswered questions. How common were organic binders beyond water and saliva, fat marrow plant gums, and in what proportions? Residue studies sometimes detect lipids or waxes, often do not, and preservation is uneven. Did makers heat ochre routinely to shift hue and binding behaviour? Experimental archaeology shows the effect, but in situ evidence varies by site. How often were guide dots an apprenticeship tool versus a stylistic choice? Dotted underdrawings occur, but not everywhere. Was scaffolding standardised? Sockets rarely survive yet high. Even outlines imply stable platforms rebuilt in similar positions across visits. The role of sound remains open as well. Correlations between images and resonance are strong in some caves, weak in others. Percussive marks on stalactites suggest play. but whether sustained musical performance accompanied painting is unknown. Bone flutes exist in the period, yet direct association with decorated chambers is rare. The scale of absence is sobering. If sea level rose more than 100 metres since the last glacial maximum, then entire karst belts now offshore once held voids that today are unreachable. If one imagines a coastline corridor longer than the line from Dublin to Rome, made of now drowned caves and shelters, the surviving inland record may be a fraction of the full practice. Even on land ice advanced over some regions and plucked away surfaces, elsewhere calcite buried images so thickly that only hints remain. What survives thus answers questions about material method and placement better than questions about story. Yet the unknowns themselves teach. They show that minds can coordinate without fixing meanings in writing, that symbolic systems can travel without becoming uniform, that groups can invest in places whose reasons are multiple and shifting. They remind that archaeological certainty lives at the scale of a burr on an incision, a soot lamina on a vault, an isotope ratio in a drip skin. Beyond that scale, interpretation must stay provisional. A quieter hopeful detail is methodological improvements in microsampling non-destructive imaging, and cave climate monitoring now allow age models to be refined and pigments to be characterized without harm. Even the breath that once threatened to alter films is now controlled by airflow management. Over time, some uncertainties will narrow, though many will remain principled mysteries. If one asks what all these open questions tell about the mind, the answer returns to patience and to scale. People in the late Pleistocene live inside planetary rhythms that redraw coasts and winds within a lifetime, and transform whole regions within a few. Against that flux, they choose chambers that move slowly, teach methods that are robust, and make images that tolerate ambiguity and invite return. The unresolved status of authorship at specific sites, the undecidable functions of specific panels, the portability of signs without a fixed key, the limits of dating, stacked strokes. Each uncertainty is not a failure but a feature of a system built for endurance rather than for exact decoding. The mind revealed here does not require a single correct reading to act. It organizes memory, attention, and belonging around images and sounds that the planet will keep, and it accepts that what is most important may be how, where, and with whom a line is made, not what a later eye will finally conclude about its meaning. In that stance, mystery is not an error. It is the room left for generations to meet the same wall and continue the conversation. They step back from the animals and hands and signs, and see what the caves have been saying all along, that the first imagination is not a flash but a practice, a slow accumulation of choices of stone light, pigment, sound, and path by which a group learns to hold ideas steady in a place the planet will keep. Fire steadies breath into a haloed hand. Relief turns a ridge into a shoulder. A doubled line becomes a lifted leg when a lamp moves. A cluster of dots settles beside a horse and waits for the next return. A voice tests a wall and finds the point where echo meets image. The fact that anchors this closing view remain simple and firm figurative paintings tens of millennia old persist on multiple continents, among them the Sulawesi Suid panel dated to at least 4,500 years, the Aurignacian lions and rhinos of Chauvet, around 36,000 years, and engraved and painted traditions that continue through the Gravettian and Magdalenian evidence that symbolic depiction is established early and endures. From this material and its habits, a picture of mind emerges. It plans because lamps, stones, pigment caches guide dots, and inferred scaffolds arrange labour before a line is drawn. It abstracts because lattices, ladders, zigzags, and ovals recur in stable relations to animals and features of rock. It collaborates because the small and large hands gather children's finger flutings, cross adults' outlines, and retracing respects a previous curve centuries later. It listens because panels cluster where the room returns the voice. It chooses darkness because deep chambers offer controlled light, constant climate, and echoes that surface places cannot. It teaches because underdrawings dotted ghost figures and mixed-age footprints turn the cave into a school whose syllabus is the wall. A lesser-known detail cuts to the intimacy of this learning. The insides of ancient blowpipes, short bones, or reeds used to spray pigment retain microscopic ochre grains, proof that breath literally becomes paint. From that coupling of body and mineral, the negative hand takes its clean edge. The unresolved mysteries remain where they belong, beside the certainties and between them. Who made the earliest Iberian red discs and stencils, Neanderthals or incoming sapiens? When calcite skins yield minimum ages older than 64,000 years, whether a ladder under a bison counted mapped or invoked, why carnivores sometimes receive pride of place while reindeer abundant on the menu do not, whether performers in masks or composites at Trois Frères stood for mythic beings or for social roles, whether finger bends in stencils are cold-tucked digits, injuries or deliberate signing, whether abstract sign repertoires are local codes, shared conventions, entoptic echoes or all at once, each question stays open because stone keeps process better than story. The planetary observation that holds these uncertainties together is that Ice Age climate moves at a scale the mind must meet with durable media, as glaciers deepen sea falls by more than 100 meters and coastlines step outward across shelves. Corridors of dry land link islands across the Sunda Shelf. Winds sharpen and dust travels, then interstadials warm and sea reclaims the shelves, drowning entrances like the tunnel to Kosker, now 37 meters below modern water. Rivers lengthen and then shorten. Herds extend their arcs by distances longer than the line from Bordeaux to Berlin, and then pull back. Yet underground temperature steadies, humidity holds, and echoes return the same note. Against that flux, caves become anchors, technologies of memory that outlast camps and routes and sometimes languages. They let a community meet its predecessors in a place whose air and curve stay recognizable across centuries. The pictures themselves, made with a few tools and a durable method, charcoal and manganese blacks, iron reds, scraped whites, a lamp and a reed, show a mind content with constraint and adept at working with it. A scraped highlight is not less than a painted sheen. A twisted perspective with both horns visible is not a mistake but a robust strategy for variable light. An animal set along a bulge is not an illusionist's trick, but a pact with geology. The system tolerates ambiguity because ambiguity is part of its strength. The same dots can count or resound. The same chevron can be water valley or rank. A composite being can hold a boundary open without choosing a single reading. That tolerance is not vagueness. It's designed for transmission in a world where certainty cannot be written and must be performed and taught. The caves show language without words, not because words were absent, but because walls keep lines better than speech, and in those lines the mind rehearses how to turn motion into knowledge, and knowledge into something that lasts. The lesser-known scale of endurance is how little material suffices. A few 100 grams of well-ground ochre can stencil dozens of hands. A single fat-filled lamp, trimmed and tilted, throws a steady light long enough to teach a shoulder and a belly. One manganese seam visited each year provides blacks for generations. Small resources meet large time because the technique is repeatable and the place preserves. The open question at the end is whether the hand that blows pigment in Sulawesi, and the hand that draws a bison in Dordogne, and the hand that incises a lattice at Blombos belong to one tradition or many. The likely answer is that both bodies and rocks and lamps pose the same problems and invite the same solutions while contact along moving frontiers lends habits. Convergence and diffusion weave a net too fine to separate by sight alone. What matters for the story of mind is that independent or connected these practices sit early, travel far and keep going. They make a ledger of attention that outlives its authors and yet keeps their choices intact enough to teach. The planetary stage turns and the ledger persists. Ice stacks the ocean in white cliffs, then melts it back. Coastlines advance and then drown. Deserts widen and then seed. Yet the horse at Chauvet still breathes under a lamp. The bison at Altamira still rides a swelling ceiling. The hand at Maltravieso still holds its crisp halo under calcite, and the pig at Leang Todongunga still looks out with a forehead crest drawn in strokes that knew exactly where the stone would carry the line. If one asks what the oldest cave paintings tell about the mind, the answer does not reduce to a sentence so much as to a way of doing things. Attend to the wall. Test for echo. Mix what the ground gives. Teach by making. Choose the deep because it keeps. Prefer marks that work in flame and on relief. Accept mysteries as part of durability. In this method, thought becomes place, and a place becomes a way to think. Fire and stone and breath together build a memory that survives glacial beats. When the lamps go out, the last wick pinched, the brand struck to leave a final smear at a junction. The chamber resets to cool darkness, and the figures wait for another lamp, held at the old height to wake them. Outside, ocean and ice negotiate the coast. Inside, the first imagination remains readable not because it tells us what to believe, but because it shows how to keep believing together when the world itself keeps moving.